Hello and welcome fellow motorsports fans, this time with a different topic. Instead of covering all sorts of different feeder series, I wanted to make one video to explain the entire Formula Racing ladder for all of those wanting to watch feeder series but not really knowing where to start, where to stop, what's good, what's bad, what's important, what isn't, and hopefully this video can point you in the right direction. We begin at the very top of the list, of course. Every kid graduating from karts to cars wants to go to Formula 1 at the very top of the top tier of motorsports. But of course, it isn't the only top tier series you can aspire to race in. There is Formula E and IndyCar and the Japanese Super Formula to sort of give you three separate alternatives to, at least for the most part, properly paid professional race seats to compete in. So essentially, the entire ladder feeds into this first tier, not just into Formula 1. Yes, Super Formula in particular has been used as a feeder to F1. Red Bull likes doing this, but there isn't a lot of precedent for the other two to achieve the same thing. In the second tier, we have the series feeding directly into the aforementioned top series. And here this was a little hard to divide because these four series listed here are all on very different levels of driver caliber. On the American side of things, you have Indy next as the second step right below IndyCar, following a lot of its schedule and sort of serving the same purpose which Formula 2 does in the European side of things. Then you have Formula 2 and Formula 3. I put them both in this tier, reason being they very much act together. You can't really go to F2 without doing F3 first, and both of these mark the international step of the ladder, where before you are competing in a regional series, at least when going straight to Formula 1. And then last but not least, we have Super Formula Light over on the Japanese side, and this series compared to the other three is rather low level, but I included it here just because it does still serve the same purpose and is the last stepping stone if you want to make it to Super Formula. Unless you're coming from the European side of things, from F2 or something, you will probably go through Super Formula Lights before going to Super Formula. These are the series which you're probably already aware of. These are the ones pretty accessible for the most part and easy to follow if you're an F1 fan, for example. Following F2 and F3 does sort of come natural and it is pretty easy to explain. Where it gets more complicated though is in the third tier of the ladder, which can be called the Formula Regional tier, which is the name the FIA does give it. It used to be called just another Formula 3 tier. And here we have the first divide between what I refer to as primary and secondary series in the category. The primary series being the ones where the top drivers tend to come through, at least in their respective series. Here on the American side, we do have the USF Pro 2000. It's just a step below Indy Next and on a similar level to all the others, but in America. On the European side, we actually have three competing offers. We have the FIA-backed Formula Regional European Championship, also known as FRACA, but it does have competition from non-FIA certified series. We have GB3, the former British Formula 3 competing, and a very recent addition since last year, but growing rapidly, we do have Eurocup 3 as sort of the Spanish F3, and essentially both of these offer cheaper alternatives to FRACA in still very, very competitive fields, and at least at the moment, it looks like they might catch up to FRACA in terms of grid strength in the not too distant future. Last but not least in this category, we have the first of what we call winter series, which is a thing especially in the F4 and the Formula Regional level, and some Formula 3 drivers, for example, do like to go back to Formula Regional for the winter. And here we have the Formula Regional Middle Eastern Championship as the primary winter category. If you have money, if money isn't a factor for you, then this is the one you compete in over the winter. In the secondary Formula Regional tier, we do have the Formula Regional Oceania Championship as the winter alternative for the ones with, maybe a little less budget. But especially last season, it still produced a very competitive grid and is a proper alternative to Formula Regional Middle East, at least to get warmed up with the car, in my opinion. Unfortunately, the same can't quite be said for the proper summer series. There's the Formula Regional Americas Championship and the Formula Regional Japanese Championship, and neither of those have particularly strong grids. This is where you can really see a clear divide between the aforementioned primary series and these two. These are just the less favorable alternatives for those short on budget. And in a similar fashion, we do have the nowadays, unfortunately, more or less dead Euro Formula Open. I hope the new chassis they're getting soon brings the series back to a primary competitor. But at the moment, it's basically a one-team show with 6 or 7 cars. So it is pretty easy to see why it's down in the secondary tier. But it does still serve the role of a Formula Regional tier series where it's rare for people to begin their career in this car. Now we get to the 4th tier, the Formula 4 level, and this is where it's really interesting, and it does take some time to figure out the pecking order between all the different series, because here young drivers do have like 24 series to choose from. In the primary category, on the IndyCar ladder side of things, we do have the USF 2000s. This is just here because there is actually just one more step below the USF 2000s on the American side, so it's just a very natural thing. Pretty decent grids, but removed from the core European competition. On the European side, we do have the FIA-backed Formula 4 series, and this is where it gets really good. We have Italian F4, arguably the most competitive one out of them all, partially because this is where Prema competes, so if you want to make it higher up the junior ladder, running for Prema is typically a good idea, so hence why a lot of F1 juniors, for example, do begin their career in the Italian F4. Then getting ever more competitive year after year, we do have the Spanish F4, nowadays in my opinion the second most competitive Formula 4 series, with also a very large grid and the top teams being Formula 2 and Formula 3 affiliated as well. Similar story, albeit with a slightly smaller and more national focused grid, is the British Formula 4. And then last but not least, the French F4, which has a very unique concept in that it doesn't have teams running the cars. It has the series itself operating every single car to ensure merit between the drivers, which does make for very tight competition and a pretty cheap package, even if it isn't the most attractive option out there. There is one independent series competing in the summer as well, but it is essentially just an extension of the Italian F4. This is called Euro 4. You will also find the broadcast on the same sites you will find the Italian F4 at. It's the same organizer, and there tends to be a big overlap between the driver pool. Essentially, for those that can afford it, it's just another 3 rounds of Italian F4. There's very competitive offerings over the winter as well there, and here I have actually chosen to include 2 of them in the primary category. There's the UAE F4 series, which is the main winter F4 series. Much like the Formula Regional Middle East, the 2 also go together over the winter, and this is where all the top people where money doesn't matter essentially choose to compete most of the time. But there is now competition from the Formula Winter Series, a non-FIA backed series. So yes, it may give less super license points, but that doesn't really matter so much on the F4 level. And this is essentially the Spanish F4 pendant to the UAE F4, and has the added benefit of actually putting all of these juniors on European tracks over the winter, so tracks that will come in more handy going forward with their careers, which they will race on a lot more often than on the Middle Eastern tracks. Now, we have a huge amount of series competing in the secondary F4 category, and here, if I wanted to, we could have tried to make like 3 different subcategories, because the levels between these do vary. There's also just a lot of variation year after year for how strong these particular grids are, but at least grouping them together like this should give you a good idea of what to expect when watching these series. On the American side, this is the easiest one to put here. It's the USF Juniors. It's the lowest step. They just have a clear 4 series ladder, so it's just natural to put it in this position. The grid is also reasonably competitive and has the added benefit of not adhering to the age limit of 15 like FIA series do. You can in fact race beginning, I believe, age 14 in this, so drivers do get a chance to start younger if they want to. In terms of the big FIA-backed series, there is a lot. I'll just list them. We have the Brazilian, the Japanese, the Central European, the North and Central American, the Indian, the Chinese, the Australian, the American, and now also the JSF4, like a cheaper alternative to the USF4, all competing under the FIA umbrella except the Ligier F4 series. And as I just said, these just vary year after year for how strong they are. I'd say the Brazilian and the Japanese, probably the most relevant of those, with the Central European one maybe in the conversation now. Last year's grid was pretty weak. This year's grid is actually looking pretty good. So time will tell where this evolves to. There's some independent competition though, once again. And first up we have GB4, which is a new evolution of GB3, the step below GB3 in that sense. So a more British series, essentially the second tier of British F4, but it's apparently very cheap and still manages to put up pretty competitive grids, so definitely one to watch. Also added bonus is just very good production value given the level of the series, so that's just a thing. If you actually enjoy watching these, that's definitely a bonus. Then there's the Nordic 4, which is a combination of what used to be Danish F4 and Formula Nordic, and it is a little bit of a mess. It does feature two different types of cars and some older drivers competing, but also has an age limit of 14. So every now and then you do find promising young drivers giving their debut there early. It's definitely one to keep note of. Then there's the F4 Southeast Asia, which is like borderline a winter series, but it's only returned last year. Time will tell how good the grid turns out this season. And we have, of course, the all-female competition over in F1 Academy. Putting this into the secondary tier might be controversial for some. I don't think it is, because the average level of that grid is unfortunately still not quite there. But at least compared to something like the Chinese F4, Australian F4, US F4 even, I think the grid is underrated, if that makes sense. So it is firmly in this tier and not like one of the worst in this tier or anything. It's not as bad by any means. And then last but not least, of course, there's also a cheaper winter alternative in F4, and it is the new Saudi F4. And here I want to highlight once again, they do follow the French F4 concept of having all cars run by the organizer, well, by one team hired by the organizer instead of separate teams competing, which ensures parity and keeping the costs down. So it's a good budget alternative to run. Now, of course, these are a lot of different series to keep up with. If you want to follow these series without actually watching every single one of them, I can recommend subscribing to the channel, because what we do on here usually is called Race Week Review, where we go through all the relevant feeder series every single week to keep you guys up to speed with who is who and who's good and who isn't. And this way you don't have to watch every single round. You can pick and choose what actually catches your interest properly. Feel free to ask any questions down in the comments. And also, please let me know if you would like to see a similar video for karting or sports cars, because both of these I think I could do quite well as well. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I hope to catch you in the next one.